DIY Vicks Vapor Rub. Is it possible? Is it effective as Vicks? Today, I'm going to show you how to make a DIY Vicks Vapor Rub that is just as effective as Vicks without all of the petroleum and extra harsh chemicals that they put in there. So let's get started. You are going to need a scale and some oil. You can use olive oil or coconut oil. I have an infused oil of comfrey and mullein, and I liked the infused oil because the mullein and the comfrey put on the chest helps to break up the congestion. So I like to use an infused oil, but you don't have to. And another thing you're gonna need is beeswax, preferably not a block of beeswax. The little pastel pellets that you can buy on Amazon or also Mountain Rose herbs are a lot preferable to this because you actually have to grate it, but it works. This is freshly harvested from our bees, so I'm grateful for it anyways, even though it's a little bit more effort. And we're going to be using camphor essential oil and eucalyptus. Now, if you're using this with small children, you may want to not use the camphor. You can just use eucalyptus, and you can also substitute peppermint. That's also a good essential oil. And then the secret ingredient that is going to make this whole salve, make it very much like Vicks, is called menthol crystals. And I buy my menthol crystals from Mountain Rose Herbs, and they are nice and potent, and I actually store them in the freezer. I don't necessarily know if you have to, but they keep their potency for me for a really long time if I store them in the freezer, because I typically only use them for salves. I use it for the Vicks homemade salve that I use, and I also use it for another pain salve that I'll show you how to make next week. The first thing we're gonna do, I made a little bit of a mistake. We are going to measure 4 ounces of oil into our jar. And this is gonna make about 4 ounces of salve, which is what I want. I'm gonna put this in here, and then I'm gonna take my scale, and I'm going to measure about ½ an ounce of menthol crystals. So I put my jar on, I press Tade and set it to ounces, and I'm gonna use these first. Okay, so my next step, I'm going to take this, I'm going to put it in a small pan with some water, and we're going to melt our beeswax. So I'm going to take this over to the stove, and while this is heating up a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and grate some of this beeswax, and then I will measure it and stick it in my oil, which you will see me do. But I'm going to put the menthol crystals aside because we're not going to use this until almost the very end, and then we're going to melt them so that we don't lose a lot of its potency. So let's go ahead and go to the stove. So I'm going to turn my stove on to about 6. And I'm going to place my oil in just a small saucepan with some water. And in the meantime, I am going to grate this beeswax. One tip that I have for grating beeswax is actually to take this and spray it down with a little bit of oil. That helps the wax to come off a little bit easier when you're trying to wash it. Now that I have a nice pile of beeswax there, I am going to go ahead and set another little glass jar on my scale. I'm going to press Tade, and I'm going to measure out 1 ounce of my beeswax. Now I'm going to take this beeswax, and I'm going to pour it into my oil. To be on the safe side, I'm going to put a funnel on top so that I don't get any beeswax in my water. So now this is what it looks like. And we are gonna keep it on the stove for about 15 minutes until all the beeswax is melted. My beeswax is completely melted. So I'm gonna bring this off, and I'm gonna go ahead and add my menthol crystals in here. And I'm just gonna stir this around until all of my menthol crystals are dissolved. So when all of my menthol crystals are nice and dissolved, when it's warm enough for me to be able to touch it with my fingers, that means that I can go ahead and add my essential oils in here. If I add my essential oils when it is too hot, then it will kill them and you won't be able to smell them at all. So because I'm using this with my kids, I'm just going to use eucalyptus. I'm not going to use camphor. But if you are using camphor, you can go ahead and do 10 drops of camphor, 10 drops of eucalyptus, or for this one, I'm just gonna do 15 drops of eucalyptus. And then you can mix it around. And if you have a glass jar. Preferably it's better if you have an amber glass jar, but for this one I don't have another amber glass jar, so I'm just going to repurpose another jar that I was using before for this oil and just make sure that I keep it out of direct sunlight. So there we go. That salve is done. I'm going to let it sit uncovered probably for about an hour or so, or overnight until it gets nice and cool and hardened, and then I'll put the lid on it, label it, and store it away. Okay, so now that your salve is all cool and labeled, it is ready to be stored away. And because this one is not an amber glass jar, which I don't really prefer, I do want to make sure that I keep it out of direct sunlight, away in a cabinet at all times, so that it doesn't deteriorate. Salves last about 2 years. But this salve particularly, I make salve every year around this time, and I'll make a year supply, so it's really never lasted longer than that, but it does start losing its potency after 2 years. So the way that we typically use this in our house, I like to use this along the chest, like over the lung area for my kids. I put it on the bottom of their feet and also along the back of their spine. This is really going to help them to breathe. Personally, for me, I've also put it underneath my nose. If I'm really congested and I can't breathe, I will do that on myself, but I would not do that on my kids. It is a little bit too much for my kids because it's too hot and it makes their eyes water. But it's really effective, and it helps also if you have a child that's consistently coughing and they can't get to sleep. Rubbing a good amount of this on the bottom of their feet also helps to quell the coughing. So I hope you really enjoyed this recipe, and I hope it's really helpful for your family as it has been for mine. Thank you, and hope you have a wonderful holiday season. Bye, friends.